Alright guys, so things are just getting crazier. The US chip war playbook is very simple. First, you throw tons of money at the problem and subsidize companies coming to the US. Step 2 is containment. You ban US companies and your allies from supplying China with the most advanced chips. Step 3 is when you realize the plan isn't working at all and you tighten the noose even more. China's tech isn't collapsing, they are innovating ahead despite all the constraints. A recent report is sending shockwaves through the world. Chinese firms are narrowing the AI gap by developing their own language models. And these are technologies behind generative AI tech like ChatGPT. To power these language models, you need sophisticated chips. The US has placed big restrictions on Nvidia's high-tech semiconductors, but China's Huawei has developed powerful alternatives. When used to train language models, the Huawei 910B AI chip is just as powerful as Nvidia's A100. Estimates put the performance at 80 to 120% of the A100's efficiency. This Chinese chip is freaking the US out. It's causing Nvidia to slash prices of their own chips in China. And we are talking about over 10% off the sticker price just to compete. Banning chips to China only fuels their progress even more. You force Chinese industries to innovate more with less, and it seems China also agrees. Beijing is blocking the use of Intel and AMD chips in their government computers. They're also telling their private companies like Tencent and Baidu to phase out foreign AI chips as well. So this is a very big disaster. Tens of billions of dollars in demand will be leaving Western companies. China used to be a big market for companies like Intel, and because of US sanctions on China, these companies are getting hammered. In 2023, money from China accounted for 27% of Intel's revenue. And since the chip war started, Intel's earnings have collapsed from 80 billion in 2021 to less than 55 billion 2 years later. And things are so bad that they are laying off 15% of their workforce. That's 15,000 jobs, guys. And when a hardware company like Intel is starved of revenue, they can't build new chips or innovate ahead. They enter a doom loop spiral. So, to contain China, the US is hurting their own domestic companies. There are only so many customers in the US companies can sell to. Cutting away the largest importer of chips is a recipe for disaster. You know things are bad when even Intel wants to head back to the Chinese market. Their CEO sees the writing on the wall. The tax sanctions will only force Chinese tech to build out their own semiconductors. They will build more affordable hardware while companies buy local chips made at home. You just hasten the demise of Western companies in the country. But Gina Raimondo doesn't really care. The idea, the optics of Washington is to deny China of everything. It's a surface level strategy that sounds smart, it sounds really tough, but it just doesn't work.
On matters of national security, we got to be eyes wide open about the threat. This is the biggest threat we've ever had. And we need to meet the moment, but make no mistake about it. China's not our friend, and we need to be eyes wide open about the extent of that threat. I am ready to win, and I'm ready to do that with all of you, but it's time to open our aperture and challenge the way we've done business in every way if we're going to meet the threat China poses and if we're going to do what needs to be done with this technology.
The problem with US sanctions is how they are forcing the world to pick sides, and this is something no country really wants. You are crippling their economies to pursue your geopolitical objectives. A great example is the US Chips Act, and this is a big subsidy the US is throwing to companies to shift production back to the US. Under the Act, the US has allocated a ton of money, and this includes $39 billion in subsidies to get new fabrication plants in the US. Intel, TSMC, and Samsung, these are some of the companies shifting to the US that otherwise wouldn't. They are building foundries in the US only because of the subsidies. The cost of manufacturing is phenomenally high in the US. There are big production issues building a foundry in the middle of the Arizona desert. That's what TSMC is doing. An industry where you need tons of ultra pure water, and you build a plant next to a desert. A very brilliant idea. Maurice Chang, who was the founder of TSMC, warned Nancy Pelosi of the challenge that it is insane, and he admitted that this simply won't work. The US is in over its head. It will be a very expensive exercise in futility. Shifting production to the US will double the cost of chips. It will be non competitive in the world markets. And this statement highlights the big dilemma chip companies face building plants in America. You only be making stuff for the US market, you can forget about exporting production out. Chips made in the US are simply too expensive, and at a certain point, US demand will hit saturation. Semiconductors themselves are inputs, and if prices of that doubles, that means the cost of other products built on chips would only rise. So the entire supply chain now becomes uncompetitive, and this is across the entire US. The CHIPS Act is taking money from US taxpayers to make products more expensive for US consumers, all because you want to punish China. So really make it make sense. Can it get worse? Yes, it absolutely can. In 2023, South Korea warned the US that the CHIPS Act wasn't fair. To get the money, South Korean companies have to sacrifice their ambitions in China. In other words, they have to decouple their production in Beijing. Digging into the details is truly horrendous for the companies. Places like Samsung or SK Hynix will have to limit their chip expansion in China. That means for the next 10 years, no new advanced facility can be built. You can't increase existing production capacity beyond 5%. Any company that violates this restriction will face a clawback of the incentives. They will have to pay back the money to the US government. We must understand how crazy this really is. The US is trying to accomplish two big goals. They want to deindustrialize China's chip foundries. The idea is to restrict capital from flowing into Beijing. The second goal is even more insidious, to cut away global chip foundries away from the world's biggest chip market, to make companies like Samsung and TSMC completely dependent on the US. China buys over 50% of all the chips manufactured globally. And this shouldn't be a surprise. They are the world's factory, and everything they make, especially EVs, needs semiconductors. By building a plant in the US, chip makers will have to sacrifice their own production in China, which means losing more and more market share over the next decade. And you best believe any chips made in the US will also have restrictions slapped on them. It's going to be another Nvidia situation down the road. The problem with the US is that they just don't know when to stop. The CHIPS Act is bad enough, but the US is taking things to the next level. They're about to hit China with even more restrictions. This time, the hammer's gonna fall on AI memory chips. The big losers will be South Korea's Samsung and SK Hynix. They are the biggest memory chip producers, holding over 50% market share globally between them. Can Raimondo really do this? Well, the US can use the Foreign Direct Product Rule or the FDPR against South Korean firms. So, if a company uses US technology to build their products, Washington can impose restrictions on their exports. And it appears Samsung uses American chip design software. It's really ridiculous. The goal is to stop Chinese companies from accessing Korean high bandwidth memory chips or HBMs, and these are needed to run AI accelerators. The US doesn't want China to build out their own AI tech and to only rely on the less powerful variants from the US. However, this is going to cut away Korea's revenue potential and just lock them into supplying US companies. The AI memory boom is going to soar to the moon. According to Morgan Stanley, demand will go from $18 billion this year to over $70 billion by 2027. So in 3 years' time, the market for HBM chips will more than triple. And we know who will be a big driver of demand. It's going to be the big boogeyman, China. They will be the biggest consumers of chips. According to Bank of America estimates, China accounts for 35% of global memory consumption. And this reliance is giving Korean firms tons of revenue. China's supply chain hasn't developed their own HBMs yet. It could take more than 3 years or maybe 4 years before they can compete. But the catch up game is nothing new to China. They have done it in multiple industries before, from shipping to electric vehicles. China went from last place to first place within a matter of years. Chinese firms are not sitting still either. CXMT is investing $2.4 billion to build a new chip plant to develop AI memory chips. They are also talking to South Korea to buy the tools to produce the chips. And what do you think will happen once China begins making their own HBMs? They replace all local demand with their own production. They will displace all foreign semiconductor imports, especially those from the US. In a big twist of irony, the US is actually helping China flesh out the entire supply chain across the entire semiconductor industry. US restrictions are helping Beijing sanction proof their most critical industry. Raimondo should really get a medal. America's strategy is to beggar thy neighbor to contain their biggest rival, but it's a delaying action campaign. Chinese industries will slowly gain ground while you gradually lose ground, and you burn a ton of money in the process. And US allies are getting really sick and tired of this. In a shocking report, ASML from the Netherlands and Tokyo Electron from Japan gates to dodge the new US chip export rules. In other words, the sanctions have failed. These two companies are the main suppliers of chip making equipment to the world, the lithography machines. And this is a clear sign that G7 companies are getting tired of US sanctions. After the US first announced the sanctions, Tokyo Electron and ASML stock fell by 10, 20, or even 30%. It was a bloodbath and investors got clobbered. Crippling your own industries for the US isn't a good idea. Cutting off China is cutting away 50% of your revenue. It will cripple the future of semiconductors. However, this just got weirder. Japan and the Netherlands have been exempted and can export to China now, and South Korea might actually win the exemption as well. However, the US wants to protect the G7, but other countries like Taiwan, Singapore, and Malaysia might be on a chopping block. They might be banned from exporting to Chinese foundries. Washington is basically choosing favorites here, and it's going to piss off many countries around the world. I find this grossly unfair, right? Either you target the whole world or you stop all the sanctions. So companies will have to choose. Do we continue using US technology or do we sell chips to the biggest market in the world? The answer should be ultra obvious by now. But let's circle back to the CHIPS Act because it's about to go off the rails once again. The grand plan is to reshore manufacturing back to the US. However, it's still impossible to escape Chinese goods. So US lawmakers are going to self-sabotage themselves again. It's like they really can't help themselves. They want recipients of the CHIPS Act money to boycott Chinese tools. Intel and TSMC, for example, won't be able to buy Chinese gears for their US plants, which means their tools will have to be American made. This is yet another short sighted measure to decouple from China. Sure, you can buy everything made in the USA, but global supply chains exist for a reason. It is to keep manufacturing costs down to keep it at a minimal. The chips made in the US are going to stay in the US. The price will be so high that exporting them out will be impossible. So the big loser will be the US consumer once again. They will get fleeced twice. First in their taxes and when they buy stuff with chips in them. So if you're American, be prepared for higher inflation. Your computers, refrigerators, and your cars are going to get more expensive. Reshoring sounds nice, it sounds great, I love it. But the way the US does it doesn't make logical sense. But let me know what you think. Will the US win this chip war? And will this really hurt China's tech industry? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.